Welcome to Revolution Against Evolution. I'm your host, Doug Sharp, and this is Rich Gear.
My co-host. I'm the co-host, Rich Gear. You don't need to introduce me, Doug. I'm good enough myself.
All right, we have a special guest, Ian Juby, again, talking about his exciting developments with the First Nations in Canada and the network that he's setting up to provide science education. So let's continue this, Ian. And
Red Record Part 2.
Right.
And we'll actually get into the red record this time.
Yeah, I'm excited about that because we got all the background last time, and now I want to come into the meat of the issue. What's really going to happen? You got two separate things you've been working on. So
yes, because they're two totally different things, but it's kind of like a multi-pronged approach, right? So the children's show, this First Nations kid whom I'm calling Jeremy for the moment, he in the show is very interested in cultures and languages because, as we already know, things like all the cultures having legend, myth, or historical record of a global flood, that's really important. That's powerful evidence of a worldwide flood and the dispersion of Babel. So he knows about all this stuff, and he's really interested in languages. And that's why I've been trying to pursue and learn as many First Nations languages as I can, because, well, here, let me introduce you to Jeremy first. So we were talking about artificial intelligence the last
week, yeah.
Yeah, two episodes ago. So, yep. So my artist and I, we were really struggling with what Jeremy would look like. So his favorite subject is chemistry. And the start of every show, you know how the Simpsons, it starts off, every opener is different, but it's the same. You know what I mean, right?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I haven't watched Simpsons for quite a while, but yeah.
Yeah, so they have variations at the opener, and it's long too, right? So I'm doing that as well. So at the beginning of every episode, we go through each of the 5 kids, introduce the 5 kids, and they're each doing something different. Jeremy, he is always flying a rocket pack at the start, out of control, and his smoke trail is spelling a different word in the sky every show, and it's some word relating to that episode. And then he crash lands in a pond, right? So he's First Nations. We're trying to figure out, okay, so what's he going to look like? He's going to have a lab coat just like all the other kids, but he's going to put like native flourishes on it. What would those be? And we were really struggling with this, right? So that's when I went to Mid-Journey Artificial Intelligence, and I put in a bunch of keywords, and it spat out a whole mess of different images. And so I was using this strictly as inspiration. Wow. I had no intention of using any of this in the show. It was just to give us some ideas, right? And so like, that's one, whoops. And so this is some of the stuff that artificial intelligence came up with.
Wow.
And if you recall some of the things we talked about with artificial intelligence there a couple of weeks ago, yeah, you kind of understand and you'll see why it came up with these things, because it's looking up images of First Nations people and scientists and lab coats and trying to put them all together. So this is what Oren came up with. My artist. Now, Oren, his stepbrother, also happens to be, he's First Nations. I think he was Algonquin. I've forgotten. So he had some input into this as well. Into like, for example, the long hair and the braids. The braids were very important. So this was all part of the character development. And there he is wearing his rocket pack. And the one thing I didn't like about this was that his lab coat doesn't look like a lab coat. Yeah. It's really short.
Well, it kind of looks like a safari outfit, maybe, a little bit.
Yeah. And so I brought that up with Oren, and he's like, well, yeah, but if we put a long lab coat on, then every time he fires the rocket pack, it catches fire and it burns it. And I was immediately like, perfect. That's exactly what we will do. And so now every time it's a running joke in the show. The back of his lab coat is burnt off in a big hole. And so every time he turns around, the back of his lab coat is burnt, right? So that's what we've come up with for Jeremy so far.
Well, you could also come up with an asbestos lab coat, but the problem is asbestos is just as rotten as the flame on. So I guess you're back to square one there.
Yeah. And that gets rid of it. Then we lose the running joke. It's a running joke. It'll be funny. So having the back of his lab coat burnt off. So, of course, Jeremy, his specialty is cultures and languages, especially First Nations languages and cultures. Now, we were talking about, the story of a worldwide flood being so prevalent, literally hundreds of isolated cultures and languages around the world. We had one here in Canada on our Canadian $20 bill. This one was printed 2009, but there is the Haida Gwaii version. So this is out in the BC West Coast. And so our Canadian $20 bill actually had one of the First Nations flood myths depicted on the Canadian $20 bill. And that is actually a fantastic piece of artwork, which is now on display in the Museum of History. It was originally called the Museum of Civilization in Hull, just across the river from Ottawa. But just a wonderful masterpiece by a Haida Gwaii native on the west coast of Canada. And there is a ton of similarities between the different flood myths throughout the First Nations stories. For example, one of the common things I've noticed is the raven. Even the Inuit have the raven as the creator. I'm going to kind of explain a little bit about Noah first, but this Turtle Island thing, for example, that we mentioned last show, North America is Turtle Island. And something that's extremely prevalent in so many of the flood legends is this turtle. Like, what is going on? It's even over in India with Vishnu, the fish god.
Isn't that the one where don't they think the Earth is resting on a turtle, or is that related to that? I just didn't. Yeah.
Now, in the case of Vishnu, I would contend that is Noah, because the name Nu and You, that is one of the variations of the name of Noah. Yeah. We've even seen that in our English Bibles. Nu, Nue, Noe, Noah. These are all variations of Noah's name. So where does the Vish come from? Well, Vish, the ancient Sanskrit, that word actually means basically of the water. So it became the word for fish because it was originally intended just of the waters. So fish are of the water. So that's kind of why it became associated with fish. That was the word for fish. So really, when you're looking at Vishnu, the fish god, what you were looking at is Noah of the waters. And one of the forms he takes is that turtle again. What's going on there? Over the Algonquins also have that. The Seneca as well. They have that as well. It's very, very prevalent. Like, what's going on there? And I think the clue will be found in the Seneca. So the Seneca language. I mentioned in the last show, one of the reasons why I've been studying the First Nations languages, trying to learn as many as possible, is because of the attempt to eradicate the Indian completely. Yeah.
They did that here down in Michigan. We talked about that at the Historical Museum. Yeah, and that's very common. And I think they were trying to get rid of paganism. I think it was maybe one of the things, but they wanted to put white culture in everything, not really understand. Because I've read many things over the years. When you go back to Genesis and share stories, many of the myths and legends in their own cultures segued very well. They could see the story and they go, wow, But then we got into this arrogance where we tried to eradicate all the good things, or all the things that were not necessarily bad, but and say, well, here's the real story of what happened, and your story actually talks about it, but you've mythologized it or spiritualized or allegorized it. That's not necessarily wrong. It's just here's what the real time-space story was. And I was fascinated with those kinds of correlations. I've seen this over and over and over again down here and down in America, United States. I've seen a lot of those stories, those legends, even stuff like when Doug and I went out to Mesa Verde, and we're talking about the Kiva, and the stuff where there's this little hole they have in there, basically because they were in the underworld, which was covered in water. And then they saw this opening in the sky, and they opened out. I'm probably butchering it, but basically the concept, they looked upside, and they went outside and come into the overworld, which is this. It always reminds me of the opening of the ark door, the ark window. They could go see the sky after the floodwaters. The whole world's covered in water. Again, it's a little esoteric, a little bit out there, but you can see the connections in so many respects. It's like, the old Greek, Greco, and Roman and Babylonian legends. You see stories that even though they're mythologized, you see the grain that's in the biblical narrative showed so explicitly. It's an amazing thing. That's why I say, how could only God could have written this book? Yes, he used human agency, but it remains its integrity in a time-space reality that makes sense. That's not mythologized or allegorized, and especially it seems to relate to all cultures can read that and understand it. You know what I'm saying?
In the Superstition Mountain Museum in Arizona, they have the Apache and the Pima Indian flood stories.
Yeah.
And so we've got those as well, which is pretty fascinating.
Yeah. How many languages, by the way, have you learned already, or come to, I'm not saying you speak them, but understand them or read and study them?
I'm still working on the English language. I started off in Cree. Number one, because it was the most commonly spoken First Nations language in Canada. But as I found out, I think I was showing you this before. So I made this myself. This is actually the Cree syllabic. And if you put it in a compass, it makes it real easy to memorize because there's only 4 vowels and there's only 10 consonants. And so like this one right here would be the consonant M with the vowel E. So me, that would be the me sound. And so all you do is you memorize the 4 vowels and then the 4 points of I, U, A, and E. And you can very quickly memorize the orientation because all they're doing is they're taking the same character and orienting it in different directions around the compass. And so it was just a method to help memorize.
Does that work with the other languages you're working on, or did?
That was a bonus. I didn't know that when I first started out. But for example, this is Inuit, and it's the same syllabic, but with some modifications. They only have 3 vowels, but they have a few more consonants. So you'll see shapes down here in the syllabic that you won't find in the Cree syllabic. So I got to work on like memorizing those. But like this one's real easy because it's a V shape. So that is the V sound. Whoops, sorry. There's my finger in the road. So it's just the V in different orientations. So that one's real easy to remember. Wow. But anyway, so that was where I started there. But coming back to that, so all these languages are becoming extinct because when the First Nations people were stuffed into residential schools, forced away from their families to separate them from the culture, forced not to speak their language, and now the languages have slowly become extinct. And this is a terrible tragedy. The Seneca language, there's an estimated 25 people left in the whole planet that are somewhat fluent in the Seneca dialect. Wow. So, and the Seneca dialect, which also again has a flood myth with the turtle being a part of the means of rescue from this flood. So when you actually take a look at that word, the word in the Seneca language for the everyday turtle, the common turtle, is Hanoa. So it's like, what are the odds that a flood legend would have the world of a scarce few people and animals saved by this thing called Hanoa? And it would so closely match the name of Noah. So
why did you use the turtle? Why do you think the turtle was used as that overarching symbol or whatever?
that's this is one of the reasons why I think. So you can imagine, thousands of years ago, shortly after the flood, the elders sit down. Okay, children, sit down. We're going to tell you the story about the great flood and Noah building a ship and saving people. And he's our grandfather, and he saved all these people and all these animals. Here, let me tell you this story. A few thousand years later, they are recalling it. It's been mutated, if you will. And now because the name Noah was so similar to the word for the common turtle, Hanoah, they get them mixed up. And so all that happens is, as it gets passed down over the centuries and centuries, it gets mutated and turned into the common turtle instead of Noah, a person named Noah. Now it's been misunderstood. And so this I think is one of the major clues. Now, when you look at again, the other cultures like the Algonquin, they talk about the Algonquin, the Mohawk, the Seneca. I think even the Haida Gwaii had this as well. There was some other commonalities, like they all talk about they're on this floating vessel on the flood, and someone needs to go down and grab some mud from the old world, which is now underwater. And in the Algonquin, depending on who's telling the story, multiple animals try and fail, and then a last one tries without even being asked, and in almost all the stories, they die, or at least come close to death. In one of the stories, it's a duck. In another one, it's a muskrat. But in all cases, this creature floats to the surface. It's spotted. They grab it, and here it has some mud, either in its bill or in its paw. It has mud from the old earth. They take that mud, they grow it, and make the new Turtle Island from the floodwaters. And this Turtle Island, which is North America to them, rises up out of the floodwaters. So this is common right across the board in multiple cultures now, in multiple First Nation stories. But here's the catch, which is what I've been telling all my First Nations friends, is learn the original language. Because how would we know about Hanoa if we didn't know the actual original language?
Yeah.
Instead, we just see this anglicized version of the story, which is all I've got to work with right now, is because I'm trying to track down all these First Nations storytelling stories and legends and myths, but in English, it's useless to me. It needs to be in the original language. And so let me get to what I was going to share with you. Because this was, I got to say thank you to Julie Hedin for getting me this book. She very kindly gifted me this book. It was really, really, really hard to get a hold of this. And it was really expensive when we did finally manage to get a copy. So The Red Record, the Wallum Olum. This was a fantastic book put together by David McCutcheon in the 90s. He first published this, I think, in the 70s. But what it is, this is the Delaware Lenape tribe. And they had these prayer sticks. Now, these are replicas that McCutcheon made, and these are on his website, but it's pictographs.
Yeah, it reminds you of hieroglyphics a little bit,
Exactly. And so we have this up in Canada as well. Some of the Micmac out in the East Coast, for example, have pictographs as a written language. So in the early 1800s, this guy by the name of Rafinsk, French guy, he was given a whole mess of these prayer sticks. And this is a major point that I failed to make in our podcast when we were talking about this topic. These are considered not holy, what's the word? Sacred.
Sacred, yeah.
So white man typically won't be allowed to know about any of this, which is another one of the reasons why I'm encouraging First Nations people to dig into their roots, dig into their cultures, learn your culture, learn the all the practices, because those I believe are all going to point you to the biblical account. Is what's going to happen.
Your elders, right?
Talk to your elders.
Exactly. Who are all getting old and dying off, as well as the languages being lost with them. All this, I mean, that was absolute gold, what I found about that the Seneca word for turtle. But the languages are all becoming extinct. With Seneca, it's estimated 25 people left in the world that speak it. So we're losing all of this, right? So these prayer sticks, this Rafinks guy, actually detailed and got it all interpreted and translated. And there was a lot of controversy. It also, this is very interesting. I have not found this, but he mentions in his original paper, it also had genealogies. 96 successive kings or chiefs were on these prayer sticks. The vast majority of which were named. So these prayer sticks document a history going back to 1600 BC, approximately. So it goes a long way back. I really want to see that, because then we can compare it to other genealogies that Bill Cooper brought up, right?
Yeah.
So like the Big Valley Creation Science Museum, this is the genealogy from the Lambeth Palace, tracing the genealogy of King Henry VI right back to Adam and Eve.
Really?
So you can cross-reference all of these genealogies, because they all came from Babel, and so they eventually, as you go back farther, all the names start lining up, even in different languages.
Yeah.
Which of course makes total sense, right? So, I'll go through this real quick here. By the way, here's the piece of artwork Laura did for our podcast on the fly. I asked her about this in the morning, if she had anything about Nanabush. Yeah, this, and especially if you know anything about the Nanabush myth, this is just fantastic. I could not have asked for anything better. And she did this like in a couple of hours and had it to me for the podcast live that night. But I'm going to come back to this, because this is her rendition of the Nanabush myth. And I'm going to go through this real quick. Major point I want to make here. So the word for university in Cree, Kichi Kiskin Wahamatawim Wikimik. It's a really, really long word. And the reason this is significant is because many of these First Nations languages are polysynthetic or agglutinated languages. For example, this, the Kichi, means great or greatest. You guys may have heard of Kichi Manitou, many of the First Nations names for God or the Creator.
There's a Takipi in Michigan.
Yes.
Big ring.
Yep, depending on the dialect. And there's that root word, Kichi. And then the next word, Kiskin Wahamau, which means to teach, basically. So there's the word there. And Mitwikimik, Wikimik, which is the root word. It's a building or a structure. So for example, there's the word for medicine lodge. There's the word for an outhouse. You can see the Kamek. So the reason I bring this up is because these pictographs are very similar. You've heard a picture is worth 1,000 words.
Yeah.
Well, the biggest complaint is that all of these, the guy was originally translating them. He was scribbling out his interpretations and replacing them again. Well, he's just working it out. Good grief. That has nothing to do with trying to anglicize it. He's trying to match the interpretation. So I'll go through this real quick. So here's the first prayer stick, the symbols. At the beginning, the sea everywhere covered the earth. Boy, this sounds an awful lot like Genesis already.
It does to me.
Above extended a swirling cloud, and within it, the Great Spirit moved. Now listen to the description of the Great Spirit. It's primordial, everlasting, invisible, omnipresent. The Great Spirit moved. He was bringing forth the sky, the earth, the clouds, the heavens. He brought forth the day, the night, the stars. He brought forth all of these in love to move in harmony. And again, the Great Spirit created living beings, immortals. The first humans were immortal. And then the ancestor, the spirit ancestor, the grandfather of man, gave the first mother life and the animals. And I know we're running out of time, so I'm just going to skip through this real fast.
It's fascinating, I'll tell you.
But it's a fascinating book. He did such an awesome job in this. Those ancestors, the first men were alone. So the first women were brought to them. Again, over and over, it just matches the biblical account. And what's really interesting, the people who are claiming this is a hoax, which, by the way, it does talk about a great flood, flooding and flooding, filling and filling, smashing and smashing, drowning and drowning. At Turtle Island was Nanabush. There's that Nanabush again. The great hare grandfather to life, the grandfather of humanity. But after this flood, get a load of this. Where is it? There it is. It apparently talks about the Ice Age. Their home was icy. Their home was snowy. So this is decades before the Ice Age was even proposed as a theory. And the animals, all the big game, went north. So they chased it to go north. Well, if it was a hoax, why on earth would you write that into your hoax story? It makes no sense. So anyway, we gotta cut it. We gotta cut out of here, eh?
Oh, this is so good, man. I want to do another show now. Not necessarily now.
We're going to have to talk about the Misha Pishu in Lake Superior Provincial Park someday.
Oh yes, I still haven't made it there, but you did.
We did.
Yeah, we did. We'll have to do a lot more of this. We'll see you next time on Revolution Against Evolution.